another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And welcome back to my series, A Closer Look. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at the Nubian people. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below. To begin, the term Nubia itself doesn't really have a legitimate historical basis, but it's often used to refer to the various groups of people who live just south of an agreed upon Egyptian border. The idea of a specific Nubian people that we identify today are a people whose identity has been created strictly based on the diversity of Sudanese history. In other words, they're a collection of the various people groups that began to form an identity mostly after the Arab invasion of the region. The Nubian ethnic group today consists of a people who carry ancient Sudanese ancestry and ancestry from intermarriage with foreigners, largely Arab. So let's keep that in mind. The Nubian people identify their ancestral homeland as a stretch of land along the Nile River that covers hundreds of miles south from the first cataract near Aswan in Egypt to around the fourth cataract in northern Sudan. The Nubian languages are classified as an Eastern Sudanic language, a branch of the Nilo-Saharan group. Nubian-speaking peoples may have started to migrate from the Kordofan and Darfur regions of western Sudan to the Nile Valley about 2,000 years ago, settling in the Kushite Empire. According to a scholar at the University of Cologne, two now Nubian languages survive today: Nobin, previously known as Mahas, spoken in southernmost Egypt and northern Sudan, and Kenzi Dongolawi. Kenzi is spoken north of Mahas in Egypt, while Dongolawi is spoken in the south around Dongolo. Kenzi and Dongolawi are considered dialects of the same language. There are an estimated 605 Nobin speakers and around 1 million Kenzi Dongolawi speakers. There can be no doubting the antiquity of Nubian people, as they have ancestry deriving from the most ancient Nubian cultures and people in the first African civilization of Sasedi. After the fall of the various Nubian kingdoms and empires in the region, many of the Nubian people in that region first converted to Christianity via their interactions with Christianized Egyptians in the north. Less than a century later, Nubians were resisting Arab dominance in the region and later intermarried with them. Intermarriage with Arabs led to the gradual conversion of the Nubian matrilineal kinship system to the Arab-Muslim patrilineal system, shifting control of Nubian properties and princedoms to Muslims, and the adoption of Islamic religious practices by not only the ruling elite, but by the wider population as well. Nubian villages were built as close to the Nile as possible. Their economy is based on subsistence farming, animal husbandry, and date production. For centuries, the scarcity of cultivable land, especially in Lower Nubia, encouraged the migration of male Nubians in search of work, leaving most of the agricultural work to women, children, and old men. Water wheels, an invention introduced during Roman times, were used in some areas for irrigation up until the 1960s. Nubian kinship is based around tribe systems. The people favor cross-cousin marriage, in which marriage occurs between the children of two siblings of the opposite sex. Nubians today are Sunni Muslim and adhere to the Maliki school. After Great Britain assumed control of Egypt and Sudan between 1880 and 1900, the Nubians were generally left in peace, and for the first time, free of invading armies. But as the Nile waters began to rise after the completion of the first Aswan Dam in 1902, the fate of Nubian people and much of their history was sealed. Despite the destruction wrought by the creation of the Aswan Dam, much of Nubian culture survived. In particular, Nubian music and dance have become internationally popular. Traditionally, Nubian music integrates percussion instruments such as the bongo and hand clapping. Today, it also incorporates salsa and samba rhythms. Interestingly enough, Nubian musicians have brought on inspiration from Jamaican reggae artists, more specifically Bob Marley. The first dam and its subsequent elevation in 1912 and 1933 crippled Lower Nubia's agricultural system and had a profound social and cultural impact. While Nubian men had always left their villages in search of work, either as mercenaries or laborers, the increasing loss of Nubia's very limited agricultural land accelerated the labor migration. By the 1960s, 60% of Egyptian Nubia had been destroyed or rendered unfit for habitation, and 70,000 Egyptian Nubian men and women were living outside of Nubia. Those who had remained in the villages were overwhelmingly women, children, and the elderly. The collective Nubian identity has been celebrated in poetry, novels, music, and storytelling. They use their own writing form, and many still practice scarification, even though that tradition is beginning to die down amongst the youth. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help in its continued production in civilizations and world history, Nubia, for quite some time, was known as a rival to Egypt, and without question, one of the most powerful militaries in Africa. Even though the most recognizable Nubian ruler is King Taharqa today, the greatest of all the Nubian kings, the ruler who initiated the unforgettable African Renaissance, was no doubt his father, King Pi. And dominion was withering away. King Pi was on the throne in Kush. Egyptian authority and dominion was withering away. Deep rivalries in Egypt ushered in social, political, and religious fragmentation. There was a lot of civil unrest during this time, with various provincial Egyptian and Libyan lords vying for power, but it was a Kushite that proved to be the greatest ruler in the Nile Valley at the time. The Nubian monarch, King Pi, brought back cultural, religious, and civil stability back into North Africa, in what has been coined the African Renaissance. Northern Egypt at the time was divided into independent kingdoms and did not agree on much, but they all seemed to not want the Kushites to rule Upper Egypt, as previous Kushite rulers such as Alara and Kashta were beginning to gain much influence there. King Pi appears to have inherited the throne of Kush from his father, Kashta, who is believed to have been the first to initiate Kush's invasion of Upper Egypt. 4 northern Egyptian kings joined together and planned an attack. King Pi began to see the uprising in the north and was going to put an end to all the division once and for all. However, this mission was not viewed as an invasion, but a calling from the great god himself, Amun, a rescue and restoration of Nile Valley culture. King Pi viewed it as his mission to restore Ma'at to Egypt. He was honor-bound to reunite the two lands, crush the internal conflict, and reestablish the indigenous and true African spiritual significance and power. In order to truly understand his ideological stance, we must first understand a little about ancient oral tradition. One ancient Greek historian named Diodorus suggests that the Nubians may have been the first men on the planet, and he seems to give ear to the idea that it was the Nubians who were the first to institute the worship of the gods, and that Egypt was simply a colony of ancient Nubia. This ancient oral tradition is in direct contrast with what many believe today, but it was considered common knowledge back then, and King Pi was not only inspired by that ancient narrative, but sought to remedy the issue of Egypt's social religious corruption by rescuing the old Nubian colony. That is the African perspective that is often neglected. He took the name Semitawe, meaning uniter of two lands, and rallied his army, yoke the war horses, the best of the stable, draw up the line of battle. Inscribed on a 6-foot square block of pink granite are the details of King Pi's rescue of Egypt. King Pi sent forces north to battle the coalition of 4 kings, instructing his men to go quickly and press on. But when they arrived at Thebes and the temple of Karnak, they were to purify themselves. King Pi told them, "You shall enter the water, you shall bathe in the river, you shall dress in fine linen, unstring the bow, loosen the arrow." Karnak was Amun's temple after all, and since Amun had sent them, they must pay their respects. Grim and determined, King Pi's army marched north. On the Nile, they found many ships coming upstream bearing soldiers, sailors, and commanders, every valiant man of the Northland, equipped with weapons of war. The army from Kush absolutely demolished them. They apparently made a great slaughter that day, and Egyptian troops and their ships were captured. The two enemies clashed on land as well as on sea. Kushite soldiers chased the armies of Egypt and slayed them in their own neighborhoods. laying siege to cities and sending captives back to Kush, and still they pushed northward, doing battle as they went. King Pi wanted to join his army, but first he had to keep his promise to attend the festival of Opet. No king of Egypt could afford to ignore the rituals of the Opet festival because they confirmed the king's right to rule. If King Pi expected the people to accept him as the divine king of Egypt, his place was at Karnak. This was the most important festival of the year. The flawless victory of King Pi over Egypt was not only swift, but filled with honorable and merciful deeds. His victory stela gives us insight into his own personality as he cared deeply about his horses and their condition, making sure that they were taken care of. He forgave his enemies, treating the defeated kings with generosity by appointing them governors of his newly acquired lands. The words of the Kushite king makes a religious proclamation, and he celebrated his victory in the context of divine intervention. Because for King Pi, the conquering of Egypt was a holy war. Hear what I did, exceeding the ancestors. I, the king, image of God, living likeness of a tomb, who left the womb marked as ruler, feared by those greater than he. His father knew, his mother perceived, he would be ruler from the egg, the good God, beloved of gods, the son of Re, who acts with his arms, Pi, beloved of the moon. King Pi had no desire to remain in Egypt. Kush was his home. He had fulfilled his holy obligation to Amun and reunited the two lands. Now he could return to the center of his empire, Kush, and rule from there. When he died, he was buried in his homeland just north of the Holy Mountain. King Pi should be recognized as the greatest ruler in Nubian history, as he was the one that successfully reaffirmed ancient Nile Valley religious traditions, temples, and artistic forms, while introducing some unique aspects of Kushite culture. It was during the popular 25th dynasty that the Nile Valley saw the first widespread construction of pyramids since the Middle Kingdom. After the 25th dynasty of Egypt, one can make the argument that Egypt was never truly the same again, as it was constantly invaded and ruled by non-Africans. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help out in its continued production, please consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.
Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part 1, Introduction. Egypt lies in ruins. Alexandria has fallen, and thousands of Roman sandals now walk the banks of the Nile, consolidating the gains of Caesar Augustus. Egypt, as it had been known for thousands of years, was no more. Cleopatra Philopatra VII lies dead, killed by her own hand in an effort to spite her enemies and deprive them of their trophies. Another queen beyond the southern border looks north at the smoldering ashes of the nation's longtime rivals and sighs deeply. The winds of war were blowing south, and the all-consuming beast that was Roman imperial ambition set its sights on the gold, ivory, and other coveted goods that streamed north from this ancient empire. Kush, however, and their warrior queen Amalarinas were not interested in submitting to foreign rule. The drums of war would soon beat in the hearts of Nubian warriors. The only question was when. What we are talking about is the almost forgotten war between Rome and Nubia that immediately followed the fall of Cleopatra's Egypt, which was the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and finally closed the book on Egypt's ancient civilization as it had been known for thousands of years. Unfortunately, the sources that we have on the events that took place following the fall of Egypt are not Nubian. This is not for the lack of written sources, but more so due to the fact that the language of the Kushites is lost to us. Maratic, as it is now called, used many of the same character letters found in the various scripts used by the Egyptians, and even their languages, both being Afro-Asiatic, were similar. However, we have yet to uncover a Rosetta Stone that will crack the code for all of us and tell us about the lives of the Kushites in their own words. For now, we have accounts of the war from Strabo, which detail the conflict as well as the artifacts found in Meroe, the old capital of the Kingdom of Kush. End of Part 1. Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part Part 2. Background and Politics. In order to properly understand what led to this conflict, we have to start several years earlier with the death of Julius Caesar and the subsequent fallout. Julius Caesar was crowned Emperor of Rome and was killed on March 15, 44 BCE on the steps of the Roman Senate by high-ranking members of the Roman elite. This included Marcus Junius Brutus, Cassius Longinus, and Decimus Brutus. This led to a crisis of leadership as there was no clear plan to follow up after the assassination, and Julius Caesar still had powerful supporters, among them being Mark Antony, who was a powerful politician and military commander, Cleopatra, his former lover and the Queen of Egypt, and Octavian, his heir, grandnephew, and adopted son, who was a young but emerging political leader. After much political wrangling, the dust had finally settled, and Octavian, later called Caesar Augustus, renamed in 27 BCE, took over rule of the Roman Empire. He still had to contend, however, with Mark Antony, who used his political clout to make Caesar Augustus's rule difficult. Mark Antony made claims to leadership of regions like Cisalpine Gaul, and even tried to rouse the Roman public against Caesar Octavian in open rebellion. In the end, they settled on making peace by dividing the empire into a new triumvirate. Rule of the empire was to be divided between Caesar Augustus, who controlled Gaul, Hispania, and the Alps, Mark Antony, who controlled Greece, Anatolia, Cyrene, and Asia Minor, and Lepidus, who controlled the provinces of Africa. All other areas were ruled collectively by the triumvirate. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, saw this chaos as an opportunity to break from Rome and seek full autonomy. While Egypt was not officially considered part of the Roman Empire, it was a liquid client state, a legacy passed down to Cleopatra by way of debts incurred by her predecessors. Control of Egypt meant access to grain, papyrus production, and luxury goods hotly desired by the Roman elite. This included pelts, precious gems, and the like from kingdoms south of Egypt, like Kush and the city-states of Punt, access to trade goods like silk imported from as far as India that came in by sea, and many other goods that were not easily accessible or produced in the Mediterranean. Using the wealth produced by Egypt, Cleopatra helped to fund some of Mark Antony's military campaigns against the will of the other two-thirds of the triumvirate. Eventually, she and Mark Antony, through their close political relationship, eventually became lovers. And then they married, after, of course, Antony's divorce to his Roman wife. After a series of offenses by the couple, some real and others imagined, against the Senate and the spirit of Rome, Octavian declared the final war of the Roman Republic. While much of this war did take place in Egypt, it was less a war against Egypt and more so a war between Octavian and Mark Antony. After the Roman victories of Actium and finally the Battle of Alexandria in 30 BCE, Egypt was declared a Roman province. This shifted the balance of power in the region. Egypt had long been a buffer state and trade zone between Kush and the Roman Empire. Now that their longtime rival had fallen for the last time, never to rise again, Queen Amadarinas had work to do. The Kushites, throughout their history, were famed for the quality of soldiers that they produced. For millennia, mercenaries from Kush were found in depictions fighting in the armies of the pharaohs. Many of them had risen to high ranks in the Egyptian army, and they even ruled Egypt during the 26th dynasty. The soldiers that they produced were well respected for their size, strength, and skill with the bow. This tradition of skilled archery carried on into the Islamic conquest, where al-Badr referred to them as the pupil smiters for their uncanny ability to successfully target the eyes of their enemies with their bows from a significant distance. But that, however, is a story for another time. Their queen, Amadarinas, her full title in Marathi being Amanirse Kore Likipili, meaning Amadarinas, Queen, and Kandaka, ruled Kush from 40 BCE until her death in 10 BCE. Because we are as yet unable to translate Marathi script beyond the names of people and places, there is much that is unknown about her early life. What she is most famous for, however, is leading her armies from the front against the Roman invasion in a bloody 5-year war, and emerging victorious. End of Part 2. Rome and Nubia, the Marathi War. Part 3. The War. The war between Rome and Nubia did not immediately follow the fall of Egypt. Initially, there was a peace deal struck in which Rome promised not to invade Kush so long as they paid tribute. Queen Amadarinas begrudgingly signed this agreement, not wanting to plunge her nation into war. Despite Kush's reputation for producing some of the finest warriors of their time, Rome was still far larger, and regardless of which way a war went, it would be costly. Unrest grew in the Roman province of Egypt, specifically in Thebes, as Rome increased taxes to pay for the expenses incurred fighting Mark Antony, and also to fund military expeditions into Arabia. Despite its agreement with Kush, Rome expressed interest in annexing the Kushite territory of Wadi al-Aki in order to access the gold mines of the region. Tensions were further exacerbated by the Romans imposing taxes on Lower Nubia, which was also a contravention to the treaty. The saber rattling began, and the Nubians, as a show of strength in response to the Roman breaches to the treaty, started to send raiding parties across the Egyptian border. In one account of the war, it was said that Queen Amalrina sent a bundle of golden arrows to Caesar Augustus, saying that he could accept them as a token of friendship, and if he still chose to go to war, that he could keep them, because he was going to need them. The raids and passive-aggressive threats of violence would not deter Octavian's resolve to take Nubia. Only blood, iron, and fears of human carrion could change that. Early on in the preliminary border conflict, her husband, King Tetricus, was killed on the battlefield, leaving Queen Amalrina and her son, Prince Akinidad, to lead the armies. In 27 BCE, early on in the war, the Kushites had made great advances going as far north as Thebes and Cyrene, sacking the cities and taking untold numbers of Roman soldiers as prisoners. Most famously, they pulled down statues of Caesar Augustus, keeping the head of one of these statues as a prize to be buried under the queen's throne as a sign of her power and as a sign of disrespect to Caesar Augustus. The head was found in the 19th century during an excavation of the ruins of Meroe, buried under the foot of the queen's throne, Aelius Petronius, and initially tried to set terms with Amalrinas at Dhaka. The terms of peace were not accepted, and the war continued. The Roman army pressed into northern Kush, and then besieged the city of Napata. Amid the flames, gladius and battle axe crossed. Thundering horses came against trumpeting war elephants. Spears, pillars, and arrows fell from the sky in every direction. The ancient temples of the religious capital of the kingdom of Kush were burned to ashes, and among those laid low was the queen's own son, Prince Akinidad. From Napata, the Roman army marched on Meroe, meeting stiff resistance from the Kushite forces stationed at the fortresses between the two cities. The march towards the Kushite capital was not completed, and the Roman army had to pull back into less hostile territory and set up an encampment at Castle Ibrim. In typical Roman fashion, Petronius had the camp well defended, with quickly built fortifications and well-positioned ballistae, making assault on that position on top of the hill he was stationed, a near-suicide mission. That being said, Queen Amalrinas had so arrayed her army of many thousands of men in such a way that further advance from the Roman army would not be possible. And so the stalemate ensued. End of Part 3. Rome and Nubia, The Forgotten War, Part 4, Conclusion. Wanting this foreign army out of her lands more than anything else, the queen sent envoys to Petronius, who then forwarded them to Caesar Augustus. In 22 BCE, an agreement was struck on the island of Samos between Rome and Kush. Kush would pay to Rome what tributes were owed before the war, and pay compensation for sacking the towns of Upper Egypt. In exchange, Rome returned all of the Kushite land that was captured during the conflict, and trade relations were re-established. Kush would remain fully independent and was no longer required to pay tribute to Rome in exchange for its sovereignty. Relations would remain largely peaceful between the two nations, and Kush used the wealth it gained through its trade relationship with Rome to rebuild the city of Napata, and remained an important political player in the region until it eventually disappeared in the 4th century, its capital abandoned and rule over the reign taken up by the expansion of Aksum under the Christian king Ezana. End of Part 4. The content for this video was provided by the Historical African.
In terms of human history, deep human biological history, Africa has a special role as a place of the emergence of modern humans, whether from a single population that has crossed the threshold and diversified, or whether from multiple populations that have intermixed to create the fundamental basis of modern humanity. Ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt share roots, common cultural roots in Northeast Africa, in the Sahara, and along the Nile Valley. The ancient Egyptians and the ancient Nubians can both be described especially in the earlier periods, as being descendants of Northeast African indigenous populations. As one writer said, all of these people are Africans, and I define Africans as people whose biological histories have emerged and their identities have emerged in Africa, and where any mixing that took place on African soil. The Egyptians did not come from any place else other than the Nile Valley. Their identities and any other ancestry that they may have had were all forged together in that space. One becomes better known, and one's writing becomes translatable, which is purely an accident, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Otherwise, we would not be able to read the Egyptian hieroglyphs as well, so they would still be a mystery as well. We have not recovered something similar for, later period Nubia. I don't think in terms of race.
I just want to point out, something brothers point out, Egyptian history coincides a lot with our history. There were two different races, that's what he's talking right now, of black people, as y'all would call us. Really, we the children of the Creator. And you have the Africans, right? That's what y'all call them folks, right? That's not who they are. And then you have us, who y'all call African American, which is not, that's not who we are. We both was in the Nile River. This is fact. We ended up mixing with them. This is fact. They always had our back in war. This is fact. We in their land. We were around them, not under them. They actually listened to our priests and all that stuff, as y'all call it, which is high chief, really. They never enslaved us. Outside nations enslaved us. Okay? We lost the war. We was fighting alongside with Kush against outside nations. Alright? Kush became part of the family, and that's where some of the Arab come from. That's to let you know. To be honest with you. I don't say I don't want to hear this, but it's true. We did mix with the Kushites. Alright? And because we were mixing with them, and we were taken care of by the Creator, we built the big kingdom. But eventually we ruled that kingdom in a century of whatever they want to call it, although the time date's totally messed up, so you can't go by that. But we ruled. We were kings in that kingdom. You see? So eventually we had our own kingdom in Egypt. And yes, we did fall in Egypt at one point. And we was in Egypt for 200 years. So it's possible we was probably in Egypt for about 100 years. And then when the outsiders came and war against us and the Kushites, we both fell at the same time. We've been in slavery off and on ever since. Alright? And they had the Arabic Spring. The Arabs came from mixing with the Kushites. That tells you a lot. Tells you a lot. So the Egyptian history has a lot to do with our history. We're still two different people. Know that. We're two different people. But the story's more complicated than what they're actually telling you. And it was showing you in other videos that I showed you already that people were calling on these deities, and even our people was doing it, and yes, they come and help, yeah, but see, it's at a cost, man. That's why I said, why did Israel cry? Because they was lied to. They were tricked into serving these deities who would come to help them on this place, but see, not realizing they sell their soul. So what you cannot do is call on these names into these deities. What you got to do is know the Creator is in you, and know the Creator only, Creator is spirit. There'll be man or woman, never be inside of a physical body of any type, physical form or shape. It will never happen, will not be inside this place. The only place the Creator is inside this reality is in you. Okay? And of course, he makes sure he has put everything here for everything to grow. And when those things came here, all the stories that you see, from older books, even stone books, tell you that everything was already here when they came. And they changed some people, yeah. Okay? They changed people. But we don't serve them. And that's why where religion came from. And the 7 days of, he had to take 7 days as bullshit, create a fake stuff, and then it just happens. Instantaneously. Okay? Remember, the Creator cannot die. He
in
can't,
general,
the devil can.
And when I say this, I think about it in two different ways. Darwin essentially suggested that in order to say that a species was subdivided into subspecies, which would be the equivalent of races, that the populations involved would have to be almost incipient species. So a high degree of substructure. I can tell you that you cannot use the idea of any difference or being able to tell a difference either at the molecular level or physical level as indicative of or requiring the use of the term race. So I say there are populations, but no races, and I'm not the first person to say that. All of these people are connected to each other, and dividing them in a way that implies a level of discreteness that the term race implies is inappropriate. Were there people with darker skin, lighter skin, curlier hair, less curly hair? Yes, there were. There is no evidence that the ancient Egyptians, who did medicine, who made observations, and sometimes detailed artwork about the environment around them, animals, plants, there's no evidence that they had a theory of human variation that would be commensurate or similar to notions of race as they were developed in Europe. There's a deep shared ancestry in the Sahara of these societies. The fact that they were sometimes in conflict, we should not impose our reasons, our ways of thinking onto why this conflict may have occurred. The conflicts were political, social, probably over the same issues. Let's not read ideological ideas about the reason of this conflict back into the past. We have to avoid stereotypes. We have to avoid the old ways of thinking, but just put into new data sets or new types of data, which I do believe that we can see in literature sometimes today, you know. And I think that a lot of times, if you look very carefully at the scientific literature, you'll see that sometimes the old ways of thinking are lurking beneath the surface there. And this is something that needs to be addressed.